I was in Portland, Oregon, where you and I used to live, and having coffee with a young man who I didn't know. He's an acquaintance. And as he talked, he kept saying, well, life is meaningless. Life is meaningless. And this was 10 years ago. I was just starting to study this stuff. I was a lot more than 10 years ago, probably now. It was about close to 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, what if life is not meaningless? What if just your life is meaningless? And of course, he was offended by that, and we're not friends anymore. But I learned something really important, right? I learned that basically we get a blank slate with our lives. We get to do with it what we want. And if we're saying life is boring, or if we feel restless, or life feels meaningless, what we're actually saying is what I did with my story has made it uninteresting.
Who are the world's most interesting people? And what fascinating, groundbreaking, incredible things can they teach us? In this new series, I leave our Science of People lab to interview my favorite authors, experts, and celebrities for them to share their best people hacks, social skills, and stories. And let me tell you, they have some juicy tips. This is a new series I'm calling The World's Most Interesting People.
Hello, YouTube friends. We need this video today. I am so excited to bring on Don Miller. Don Miller and I met many, many years ago over dinner with friends, and we instantly connected. I have loved his books and his course, Building a Story Brand, which we used for Science People. Most people don't even know that. A little background on Don is he is the CEO of Business Made Simple. He's the host of the Business Made Simple podcast and is the author of several books, including the bestsellers Blue Like Jazz, and as I mentioned, Building a Story Brand. And his latest book, which I am obsessed with, is Hero on a Mission. He lives in Nashville, Tennessee with his wife, Elizabeth, and their daughter, Emmeline. Welcome to the show.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Oh my goodness. So how many years in the making is this book? How many years did it take to write it? It's a lifetime book, a lifetime.
At least 10 years. Yeah, I've wanted to write it for 10 years and really just would have these fits and false starts. It just didn't feel right. Couldn't explain it. And finally sat down one day and started writing, and it just began to flow. And I knew, how that is, this book is going to find the finish line here. And so I'm really glad to have it out.
So I want to start with a very specific question. This is an exercise you put at the very end of the book, and it was like a light bulb moment for me. So when I got to the very end, we're going to do it together. So if you're watching, I want you to answer this question. You asked the question, if a movie was made about your life this year, I added this year, what would it be called? So for anyone listening, I want you to put in the comments, if a movie was made about your life this year, what would the movie be called? Don, can I ask that of you? So your last year, what would your movie be called?
Well, I actually have it in my life plan. There's a little space for you to answer that question. And it's really an interesting question because a lot of us would go to, well, it'd be called chaos, or it'd be called, probably the real way to think about that question is, what would you want it to be called? Because we are much more in charge of our own stories than we think. And so mine is just, I read it every morning, a strong foundation. So this year, I want to wrap up some things that really build a strong foundation for my business, my family, my daughter, and some of the other stuff that I'm putting together. So it's a building year for me, and I want to remind myself of that every morning.
So I like that little change. And this is, again, so maybe if you're willing to be brave in the comments, you can put, what you thought last year was and what you want it to. What's your ideal name of your movie? Mine is 1 Degree Turns Towards Growth.
I love that. Slow change, right?
So when I said to Don before we even started recording that this has been a huge personal transition year for me. And I think I was trying too big of changes. And so some of the smaller changes with these questions have been incredible. And I want to get into some of this into the framework. And you mentioned, our stories are so important. And you kick off the book. That's what the whole book is about, is that each story has 4 primary characters.
Yeah.
Would you mind running through the 4 characters for us so that we can dive into how we begin to identify our own?
Yeah. Well, I noticed this studying stories and just watching movies, as we all do, that these 4 characters keep popping up. There are more than 4 characters, but 4 are in almost every single story that you experience. There's the victim, the villain, the hero, and the guide. And the victim is the one who feels helpless. They feel doomed. They don't believe there's any way out or that life can get any better. And then the villain is the one who's trying to make other people small. They're the one attacking, manipulating, demoralizing, demeaning whoever else in the story. The hero is the one who faces the challenge, usually having to do with overcoming the villain. They face the challenge and they transform into a better version of themselves that's capable of overcoming the challenge. And then there is the guide, and the guide is the one who's played the hero for long enough. They can now leverage their expertise to help other heroes win. And the big epiphany for me wasn't that there were 4 characters. The big epiphany for me was that they were all inside of each of us, that those 4 characters come from somewhere. And they're the 4 major archetypes that you find in yourself. And, I call it energy. When we operate out of our victim energy, we tend to have a story that very much correlates with the story of a victim in a movie. That is, nothing happens. We feel trapped. We don't transform. Somebody has to come and rescue us. Sometimes they don't. If we have too much energy surrounding our villain archetype, same thing happens to us that happens in the story. That is, we are imprisoned. We are ostracized. People turn against us. We could even be killed. That's what sometimes happens to a villain. And then there's the hero, and that is the one who says, okay, life is very difficult. I accept it on its terms. It's hard. It's painful. Something feels like there's wrong with it, but it is also very beautiful, and it gives us an opportunity to demonstrate courage and transform. And then there's the guide, who basically says, I've won a lot in my life. It's not as meaningful as I want it to be. And they find meaning when they turn around and they help other people figure things out. And so we each have those energies within us every day. I've noticed I play all 4 characters every single day. But the more I play the victim, the worse life gets. The more I play the villain, the worse life gets. The more I play the hero, the better life gets. And the more I play the guide, the better life gets. So 2 characters will destroy our stories, and 2 characters will build them up. And all it takes is self-awareness in order to determine how your story works out.
So that what you just said there, Don, is, I think, your true guide energy coming out. This book has given me permission to say, okay, I have all 4 of these characters in me. It doesn't mean that I have to get rid of that victim or get rid of that villain, although I'd like to. It means, can I give more hero energy to more of my day? That's right. Can I give more guide energy to more of my day? And so in that way, I was wondering, it reminded me a lot of like the scarcity or abundance mindset, in that it seems like victims and villains are scarcity. There's not enough. There will never be enough. Whereas it seems like for heroes and guides, they have an abundance of everything so they can share and give. Do I have that right?
It's absolutely true. Yeah. Scarcity mindset, especially for the villain. The villain is going to operate out of a scarcity mindset. There is not enough for you and me.
Right.
And villains think in zero-sum terms. If you win, I must lose. There's no win-win situation. And so when we find ourselves feeling like too much is being taken away from us, or we don't want to share, we don't want to help others, that's villain energy coming out.
So you walk through the most incredible exercises in the book on how to identify this for yourself. So I'm hoping that readers will pick it up and actually go through those exercises. What I wanted to ask specifically is, you mentioned a narrative void.
Yeah.
And I love that concept in the book. Can you bring it up and talk about it here for us?
Yeah, well, it actually comes out of some of Viktor Frankl's work, who's my favorite psychologist. And he talks about how many of us can experience something like an existential vacuum. And what that basically means is that we don't like our story. I was in Portland, Oregon, where you and I used to live, and having coffee with a young man who I didn't know. He's an acquaintance. And as he talked, he kept saying, well, life is meaningless. Life is meaningless. And this was 10 years ago. I was just starting to study this stuff. I was a lot more than 10 years ago, probably now. It was about close to 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, what if life is not meaningless? What if just your life is meaningless? And of course, he was offended by that, and we're not friends anymore. But I learned something really important, right? I learned that basically we get a blank slate with our lives. We get to do with it what we want. And if we're saying life is boring, or if we feel restless, or life feels meaningless, what we're actually saying is what I did with my story has made it uninteresting. And to be able to accept that agency and to be able to say, well, no, if my story is boring or restless, it's because I have made it that way. That sounds like an accusation against us, but actually it's the first step in freedom. Because if we can say, what I've done with my life has made it empty, what we're also saying is I have the power to change that. And it's a very powerful statement to say, well, I'm going to make my life something different now. I'm going to choose better friends. I'm going to choose a job that I like. I'm going to get into a project that I think demands my attention or my unique gifts. I'm going to face challenges that are impossible to me, but I'm going to become the sort of person who can overcome them. That sort of personal sense of agency gets us out of the narrative void. And so really the term narrative void basically means you don't like your story. And if you find yourself in a position where you're in a narrative void or there's an absence of story, you can change that. Culture gives us scripts from childhood through adolescence, through education. We have career stories. We have stories where we find a mate, stories where we find families. At about 40, those stories stop. Culture doesn't hand us any more stories. So a lot of people go through midlife crisis because they're looking for somebody else to give them a new story, and nobody will. So they end up with a sports car and all that kind of stuff. It's at that point, you have everything you need to create a great story of your own and an exciting story to live into. And so really what happens with the narrative void is we have stopped accepting agency over our own story, and nobody else has handed us a story as though we're a little baby, that we need that. And we tend to fall into despair, honestly. People who have external locus of control have higher levels of depression, anxiety, they make less money, they enjoy worse relationships, and so on and so on. So us accepting agency over our own story is the quickest way to heal our stories.
And there's a little caveat here that helped me put this into action. I'm hoping you can maybe give us some specific examples. You say meaning is only experienced in motion. I think what you just talked about with agency, in specific moments of our life, I think adding motion has helped me figure out this is not a theoretical exercise, that it actually happens with activity. Could you have any specific examples that you can share on what this means, how we can activate it?
Yeah, you can sit and plan your story and dream up a story all day long, but until you step into it, there is no story.
That's right.
You actually have to step into it. And stories are all based, Vanessa, stories are all based on story questions. Will the hero be able to disarm the bomb? Will the couple that has just fallen in love be able to overcome their challenge to get married? We're seeing an incredible story. This will date this YouTube video, but at current, Russia has invaded Ukraine, and it's a story that's captivated the world. Yeah. Will the Ukrainians be able to defeat the Russians and cast them out of their country? So stories happen because there's a story question. And so when we say we don't like our life, what we're really saying is we haven't moved into a story in which we're wondering if there's a story question. So, my wife and I, when we got married 8 years ago, our first year, we had 200 overnight guests. And we realized really quickly, if we're going to keep doing this, we've got to find a different way to live. So we built a house, and there's an event space in the backyard and a guest house. We've been doing this for 5 years. All sorts of story questions. Are we going to be able to get the money? Will the thing happen on budget? There was a day when we got a rainstorm and the entire hillside slid into our brand new swimming pool. And as crazy as all that sounds, we've not had a single argument in 5 years as we've done this, because it's just such an exciting story. We've understood what it was. It was a story that we're living into for the sole purpose of being able to experience a deep sense of meaning. That's why we did it. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. But if we sit around and sort of read and plan and think, it's not the same as moving, right? You have to actually get up and do something in order to open a story loop in your mind and get interested in your own story.
So I think for everyone who's listening, what really struck me is I think I get really bogged down in goals. And goals are great, don't get me wrong, but I think a different way to think about that is, what is your story, or what question do you want to ask in your story? Or as a hero, what is the exact thing you need? And the more specific you can get with that, I think that the more that your narrative has action as well as purpose. So I love that idea. I also wanted to ask you specifically, something that we talk about a lot about at Science People is not only investing in yourself helps you, but it also helps others. And you said this on page 60, and it was like music. You said, when you're interested in your own story, the stories of others are not so threatening. They get to live interesting lives, and so do you. Yeah. Have you seen with readers that there's sort of a pro-social effect, that maybe investing in your own story and knowing that others have good stories too, it helps everyone? Have you noticed that?
You tend to be like the community that you hang out with, right? And so,
Right.
Like you, Vanessa, I'm very attracted to people who are living interesting stories. And it almost doesn't matter whether they're going to run for office or they're, we've just had dinner last night with a big group that's fighting human trafficking and
Wow.
listening to all the stories around the table, about 30 people at the dinner, and listening to those stories. They're fascinating people. Human beings are interested in stories. We are drawn to them like a moth to the flame. We are drawn to them like magnets. We love stories. So whenever we say, oh, I love Vanessa, I love what she's doing, it's very, very similar to saying, I love Ted Lasso, right? What I'm actually saying is Vanessa has something very interesting going on.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than being jealous of that or envious of that, what's great is be inspired by it, learn something from it, and take it into your own story and live an interesting story yourself.
It's true. I think I accidentally discovered that the reason why Captivate was so successful, I think, is because I accidentally started with my narrative, which is I'm a recovering awkward person. And my destination is just trying to be less awkward and then guide people to try to be less awkward themselves. That was an accident. And so I think,
it's probably why I was drawn to the book, right? Because I'm an awkward person too. There you go.
I would not call you awkward, but if it's in you, it's in you.
That's because I read your book.
Okay, there you go. So the last question I want to ask is, you drive us at the very end of the book through a very, very powerful exercise of writing your own eulogy.
Yeah.
And I want everyone to buy the book so you can go through the exercise in detail on how you should do this. But as a little last kind of push of encouragement for folks who feel maybe a little burnt out, a little stuck, maybe in their victim energy or their villain energy, how has this exercise changed your life? How do you feel different that maybe they could do it too?
Yeah, well, I wrote my eulogy a long time ago, and I read it probably 3 to 4 times a week, first thing in the morning.
Wow.
And it sounds like a cryptic exercise, right? It has been the most life-giving exercise I've ever experienced. If you just do one thing, write your eulogy. And my eulogy basically outlines 3 stories that I will have lived with my life before I die. One of them is the story of my family, which is not really the story of my family. It's the story of the home that we live in.
Yeah.
And we have an 8-month-old daughter. She will be raised in a home where almost every day some exciting group of people is on campus. We call it a campus because it's 15 acres with an event space. But, just last week, the governor's team was here meeting with some criminal justice reform advocates. Next week, the 5 worst members of Congress are being primaried by 5 other candidates. And we're talking about people who should probably be in prison, but they're members of Congress. Wow. We're bringing those 5 candidates who are trying to oust them to here to talk about messaging. My daughter's going to be raised in an environment where she just thinks that stuff is normal. And so that's one story, the story of Goose Hill, the house that I live in. Another story is the story of my company, Business Made Simple, and all that we want to do to help young entrepreneurs figure out how to grow their business. And then the third story it's actually a political story where my company does messaging for handpicked political candidates who will bring the Republicans and Democrats together to compromise rather than, live in the extremes. And I know when I read my eulogy every morning, Don, you've got time. We've got about 30 years left on the planet. We're all going to die. It's no use not pretending it's not going to happen. You don't have time to mess around. You don't have time to do anything else. So it reminds me of that every day, but also reminds me when I read my eulogy, because I'm such a driven Enneagram 3, that my story will be ruined if I chase goals and don't actually connect with my wife and my daughter and my friends. And so it's done 2 things. It's gotten a sense of urgency to go achieve my goals. And it's also acted like a regulator to keep those goals from ruining my life. And it gives me a lot of balance. Without reading my eulogy every morning, I wouldn't have that experience. And so I read it every morning. And I actually had a piece of software created where I can read it and it knows that I read it, and it counts how many times I've read it, and it counts the streaks and how many times I've read it overall. And I love using that piece of software. So it's been really great. But if there's one exercise that you can do after watching this YouTube video, write your eulogy. And here's the dominant question that you want to ask: what if? just at the top of your eulogy, write what if. What if you pulled the kids out of school? What if you quit your job? What if you start asking those questions and you realize, okay, I've got 30, 40, maybe 50 years left. What if? And you read that over and over, and you begin to get desensitized to the fear of taking action. And pretty soon you're going to start moving on something. And then you're going to find yourself inside of a story that's very exciting. And it creates a deep sense of meaning for you.
Mm. I want to just thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. Your Business Made Simple strategies, story brand has changed our business. This book has brought up the really important questions for my husband and my daughter and I. My daughter is 3.5. And so I just want to, you're doing such important work. I'm so grateful for you sharing this on this channel. And I'm just grateful that you're in my life too.
Thanks, Vanessa. So good to see you again.
Bye, everyone.
Don't forget to check out all of these goodies.